Miss Pearl's hands trembled when she saw that paper in his weathered fingers. "You know I can't, Earl. Him, what will folks say? I'm 60 years old, for heaven's sake." He held her calloused hands gentle-like. "Pearl, honey, we done wasted too. Much time worrying about what other people think. The heart don't have no expiration date." Her tears fell on that dusty ground, and for the first time in 5 long years, they weren't tears of sorrow. Right there in the town square with half of Magnolia Creek watching, Earl Thompson dropped to one knee and asked Pearl May Johnson to be his wife. At 60, she thought love was done with her forever. Lord have mercy. Was she about to prove herself wrong? Y'all, let me tell you about Miss Pearl May Johnson, a woman who knew more about carrying weight than any soul ought to know. At 60 years old, she'd been dragging herself through 5 long years of pure hell since her Billy Ray went home to. Glory and Lord have mercy. That house felt like a tomb where she was burying herself alive, one lonely day at a time. Every morning, Pearl would jolt awake from the same nightmare, Billy Ray calling her name from somewhere she couldn't reach. Her calloused hands would shoot across that cold bed, searching for warmth that ain't been there in 5 years. The silence would slam into her like a freight train, crushing her chest till she could barely breathe. She'd stumble to that old kitchen, her bare feet knowing every creaky floorboard by heart, and put on a pot of coffee with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Another day without you, Billy Ray," she'd whisper to his picture on the mantel, her voice cracking like dried mud. That man's eyes seemed to judge her from beyond the grave, watching her waste away in that little wooden house he'd built with such hope and love. Pearl worked as a seamstress from home, hunched over that old Singer sewing machine 16 hours a day till her spine felt like it was going to snap in two. The steady rhythm, click, 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 was the only thing keeping her from losing her mind completely. Neighbors would bring her their torn work shirts and Sunday dresses, paying her barely enough to keep from starving, treating her like charity case wrapped in pity. "Bless your heart, Pearl," old Mrs. Henderson would say, dropping off another pile of mending like she was feeding scraps to a stray dog. "You sure are surviving well on your own." The pity in her eyes cut deeper than any knife. That particular Tuesday evening, as the shadows swallowed her hope once again, Pearl went to move Billy Ray's old work shirt to wash it. Her trembling fingers traced every worn thread, every stain, from his honest labor, and the grief hit her like a sledgehammer to the soul. She collapsed right there on the closet floor, pressing that shirt to her face and sobbing till her ribs ached. "I can't do this anymore, Billy," she screamed at the empty room, her voice raw with 5 years of bottled-up anguish. "I'm dying in here, I'm dying and nobody cares." The tears came like a dam bursting, violent and desperate, soaking that shirt with the salt of her broken heart. Outside, the mockingbirds sang their borrowed songs while Pearl May Johnson drowned in her own misery, convinced she was going to die forgotten and alone in that house that had become her prison. But what Pearl didn't know was that salvation was driving down Riverside Road in a beat-up pickup truck, and it was going to turn her world upside down in ways that would scandalize the whole town. Before we continue this emotional story, put in the comments below which city you're watching from. It'll be a pleasure to give your comment a little heart. Now let's continue this exciting story. Now listen here, sugar. While Pearl May was drowning in her sorrows, about 2 miles down that same dusty Riverside Road, a beat-up Ford pickup truck was kicking up red dirt like the devil himself was chasing it. Behind that wheel sat Earl Thompson, 65 years old and carrying his own load of heartbreak, heavier than a cotton sack in August. Earl had rolled into Magnolia Creek just 3 days prior, hauling nothing but a broken heart and whatever belongings could fit in the back of that old truck. He'd lost his beloved Martha to the cancer 3 years back, watched her waste away to nothing while he held her hand and begged the good Lord to take him instead. But the Lord had other plans. And Earl was left wandering this earth like a lost soul searching for purpose. "Martha, darling," he'd whisper to her picture on his dashboard every morning, "I sure hope you can forgive me for still breathing when you ain't." The guilt ate at him something fierce, making every sunrise feel like a betrayal. Earl had bought the old Henderson place site unseen, needing to get far away from everything that reminded him of Martha's suffering. The house was falling apart worse than his spirit. Roof leaked like a sieve. Floorboards sagged under the weight of neglect, and the whole place smelled like loneliness and regret. That Thursday morning, Earl was digging in the hard-packed dirt behind his house, trying to start a little herb garden like Martha used to tend. His weathered hands shook as he planted each seed, remembering how she'd hum gospel hymns while tending her plants. "These here lavender seeds gonna help folks sleep better," he'd tell himself, his voice cracking with emotion. "Maybe they'll help me forget the sound of her crying through them long nights." The Georgia sun was beating down, merciless, and Earl's shirt was soaked through with sweat and tears he refused to acknowledge. Every shovel of dirt felt like digging his own grave, but he kept working, kept moving, because stopping meant remembering, and remembering meant dying inside all over again. When his truck started acting up worse than a stubborn mule, Earl knew he needed supplies from Murphy's general store in town. He cleaned himself up best he could, but them grief lines were carved deep in his face, telling the story of a man who'd loved too hard and lost too much. Murphy's general store sat in the heart of town like an old friend with open arms. Them wooden floors creaked a welcome song, and the smell of penny candy mixed with feed grain took Earl back to simpler times. He was reaching for a can of motor oil when he heard the tiniest voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Earl turned round, and there stood Pearl May Johnson, looking like a ghost of herself. Her Sunday dress hung loose on her shrunk-down frame, and them brown eyes held so much pain it nearly knocked him sideways. She was holding a torn work shirt, her hands shaking like leaves in a windstorm. "You wouldn't happen to know if Murphy's got any good thread for mending, would you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well now," Earl said, his own voice rusty from disuse, "I reckon old Murphy keeps his sewing supplies over yonder by the fabric bolts." He pointed toward the back corner, noticing how she flinched when he spoke like she wasn't used to conversation. "Much obliged," Pearl murmured, turning to walk away, but something in her broken posture made Earl's heart squeeze tight. "Ma'am?" he called out gentle-like. "That heat sure is something else today, ain't it? Reminds me of summers back in Tennessee." Trunji stopped and looked back at him with them haunted eyes. "Yes, sir, it surely is. Seems like it ain't never gonna break." But Earl could tell she wasn't just talking about the weather. They stood there for a moment, two wounded souls recognizing the pain in each other, before Pearl hurried away like she was running from something that scared her worse than death itself. Earl watched her leave, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since Martha took her last breath. "Lord have mercy," he whispered to himself. What was that all about? Little did Earl know that brief encounter was gonna haunt his dreams and change everything, 'cause sometimes the good Lord puts broken people in each other's path for reasons only He understands. Y'all ain't gonna believe what happened next, but sometimes the good Lord works in the most mysterious ways. And 3 days after that awkward meeting at Murphy's, Earl Thompson found himself standing on Pearl May's front porch, clutching a torn work shirt like his life depended on it. Earl had spent them 3 sleepless nights pacing his broken-down house, haunted by the image of Pearl's hollow eyes and the way her voice had cracked when she spoke about the heat. His conscience was eating at him, something fierce, telling him that woman needed help whether she'd admit it or not. "Lord, give me strength," he whispered, knocking on Pearl's screen door with knuckles that shook worse than an old hound dog in a thunderstorm. Pearl appeared behind that screen like a frightened ghost, her face gaunt from days of barely eating, and her hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the grief right across her features. When she saw Earl standing there, her breath caught in her throat, like she'd seen something that terrified her. "Mr. Thompson?" she stammered, her hands clutching the doorframe for support. What brings you by?" Earl held up that torn shirt, his weathered face flushed with embarrassment. "Well, ma'am, I hate to bother you, but Murphy said you do mending work, and my fingers ain't nimble enough for such delicate sewing. This here's my last good work shirt, and I—" His voice trailed off as he noticed how Pearl's whole body was trembling. Pearl stared at that shirt like it was a snake ready to strike. It looked just like the ones Billy Ray used to wear, and the sight of it sent a knife of pain straight through her heart. I don't know if I can—" "Please, Mom," Earl said, his voice gentle as morning dew. "I'll pay you fair, and I surely would appreciate the help." Against every instinct screaming at her to slam that door and hide, Pearl found herself nodding. Come on in, I reckon." Earl stepped into that house and immediately felt the weight of sorrow pressing down like a heavy quilt. Everything was clean as a whistle, but cold as a January morning, like no real living had happened there in years. Billy Ray's picture sat on the mantel like a sentinel guarding over Pearl's misery. "You can just stand there by the sewing machine while I measure," Pearl whispered, her hands shaking so bad she could barely hold the measuring tape. When Pearl had to measure round Earl's broad shoulders, her fingers trembled against the fabric of his shirt, and she had to bite her lip to keep from breaking down completely. It felt like betraying Billy Ray's memory, touching another man, even for something as innocent as sewing. "Ma'am, you all right?" Earl asked, noticing how her breathing had gone all shallow and quick. "I'm fine," Pearl lied, but tears were already spilling down her cheeks. It's just your shirt. It looks so much like your husband's, Earl finished gently. I'm mighty sorry, ma'am. I can take it somewhere else if it's causing you pain. But Pearl shook her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. No, I need the work. Money's tighter than bark on a tree. As Earl stood there, he found himself talking just to fill the awful silence. You know, I've been trying to start a little herb garden behind my place. My Martha, she used to grow all kinds of healing plants. Said lavender helped folks sleep better. Chamomile calmed the nerves. Pearl's hands stilled on the fabric. You lost your wife too? 3 years ago, Earl said, his voice thick with emotion. Cancer took her piece by piece while I watched, helpless as a newborn calf. Spent 2 years nursing her through the worst of it, watching her fade away, like morning mist. The pain in his voice was so raw, so familiar, that Pearl looked up at him with recognition. Billy Ray had the lung sickness, she whispered. Took 2 years for him to go home to glory. I watched him suffer every single day, and there wasn't nothing I could do to help. They stood there in that quiet house, 2 broken souls sharing their deepest wounds, when suddenly the front door burst open. Miss Magnolia Weatherby, the biggest gossip in 3 counties, stood there with her mouth hanging open like a barn door in a windstorm. Well, I never, she exclaimed, her eyes taken in the sight of Earl standing so close to Pearl. Pearl May Johnson, what in the world is going on here? Pearl's face went white as a sheet. Miss Magnolia, this ain't... I was just at your age, Pearl, carrying on with strange men. What would Billy Ray think? Magnolia's voice was sharp as a knife, cutting deep into Pearl's already wounded heart. Earl stepped forward, his jaw set firm. Ma'am, there ain't nothing improper happening here. Miss Johnson is doing some sewing work for me, that's all. But the damage was done. Pearl had shrunk back into herself like a turtle hiding in its shell, the shame burning her cheeks red as Georgia Clay. After Magnolia left, spreading her poison all over town, Pearl made a decision that would haunt both her and Earl for weeks to come. Now listen here, Sugar. After that awful scene with Miss Magnolia, Pearl was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. The shame was burning through her veins like poison, and she could barely look Earl in the eye, but that man, bless his heart, he just stood there patient as Job, waiting for her to find her voice again. I should finish your shirt, Pearl whispered, her words barely audible above the ticking of Billy Ray's old clock on the mantel. Every second that passed felt like an eternity of guilt crushing down on her shoulders. Earl watched her work, noticing how her hands trembled worse than autumn leaves. Miss Johnson, he said gentle-like, you don't have to be afraid of me. I ain't here to cause you no trouble. Pearl's needle slipped, pricking her finger, and a drop of blood stained the white fabric. She let out a little cry of frustration that sounded more like a wounded animal than a grown woman. I can't even do this right anymore, she sobbed, pressing her bleeding finger to her apron. Here now, Earl said, pulling a clean handkerchief from his pocket. Let me help you with that. When Earl wrapped that soft cloth around her finger, Pearl felt something she hadn't felt in 5 long years, the gentle touch of another human being who cared. It scared her worse than facing down a tornado, but it also stirred something deep in her heart that she thought had died with Billy Ray. 3 days later, Earl came back with that mended shirt and a small mason jar filled with dried herbs. Miss Johnson, he said, standing on her porch like a nervous schoolboy, I wanted to thank you for the fine work, and I brought you something. Pearl opened that screen door just a crack, her eyes red and swollen from crying herself to sleep every night since Magnolia's visit. What is it? She asked, her voice hoarse with grief. It's a tea blend, Earl explained, his weathered hands gentle on that jar. Lavender and chamomile, some lemon balm I grew myself. My Martha used to make it for folks who couldn't sleep. I noticed you looked mighty tired, and I thought, you thought wrong, Pearl said, but her voice broke on the words. I don't need your pity, Mr. Thompson. I don't need nothing from nobody. But Earl didn't back down. It ain't pity, ma'am. It's one hurting soul trying to help another. I know what it's like to lay awake all night staring at the ceiling, wishing things were different. That night, Pearl stared at that jar of herbs like it was gonna bite her. The loneliness was eating her alive, gnawing at her bones like a hungry dog. Finally, round midnight, she gave in and brewed herself a cup. The smell alone brought tears to her eyes. It smelled like hope, like maybe there was still some gentleness left in this cruel world. For the first time in years, Pearl slept through the night without nightmares. The next afternoon, Earl found himself standing on her porch again, this time with a pair of torn work pants. I'm mighty sorry to bother you. Again, Miss Johnson, but The tea worked, Pearl interrupted, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. I slept. I actually slept. Earl's face lit up like sunrise after a long, dark night. I'm real glad to hear that, ma'am. Real glad. This time, Pearl invited him to sit on the porch swing while she worked. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the kind of quiet that comes when two wounded souls recognize each other's pain. You know, Earl said, watching the sun set behind the pine trees, Martha and me, we tried for children for 20 years. Never could have 'em. That sadness hung over our marriage like a shadow, no matter how much we loved each other. Pearl's hands stilled on the sewing. Billy Ray he was a good man, but he was powerful jealous. Didn't like me having friends, didn't want me going nowhere without him. Said it was 'cause he loved me, but sometimes... She stopped, shocked at her own words. Sometimes love can feel like a cage, Earl finished gently. That's a terrible thing to say about my dead husband, Pearl whispered, but the relief in her voice was unmistakable. It's an honest thing, Earl replied, and sometimes honesty is all we got left. But their peaceful moment was shattered when Miss Magnolia came marching up that dirt road like she owned it, her face twisted with righteous indignation. Behind her walked 3 other church ladies, all nodding their heads like a bunch of bobble-headed dolls. Pearl May Johnson, Magnolia hollered from the road. Folks are talking and they ain't saying nothing good. At your age, carrying on like some shameless. The words hit Pearl like physical blows, and she doubled over like she'd been punched in the stomach. Earl stood up, his jaw set firm, but Pearl grabbed his arm. Don't, she pleaded. Please just go. As Earl walked away, his heart breaking for Pearl's pain, neither of them knew that this was just the beginning of a storm that would test everything they thought they knew about love, loss, and the courage to live again. Y'all, what happened after that awful confrontation with Miss Magnolia and her gossip brigade was enough to make a saint lose faith. Pearl spent 3 days locked in that house, crying till her eyes were swollen shut and her heart felt like it was going to break clean in two. She kept hearing Billy Ray's voice in her head, telling her she was a disgrace, that she was dishonoring his memory by even talking to another man. But Earl Thompson, bless his stubborn heart, wasn't going to give up that easy. On Saturday morning, he showed up on Pearl's porch with a basket of fresh tomatoes from his garden and an invitation that would change everything. Miss Johnson, he called through that screen door, his voice gentle but determined. I know you're in there and I know you're hurting, but I got something to ask you. Pearl appeared like a ghost, her face gaunt and her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 3 days. Earl, you shouldn't be here. People are gonna talk even more. Let 'em talk, Earl said, his jaw set firm. I'm driving to the farmer's market in Peachtree Grove this morning, and I'd be mighty honored if you'd come with me. Tain't nobody from Magnolia Creek gonna be there, and maybe you could use some fresh air. Pearl's hands trembled on that door handle. She hadn't left her property in over a week, and the thought of being seen in public with Earl terrified her worse than facing down a rattlesnake. I can't, Earl. What if somebody sees us? What if word gets back to who? Earl asked gently. Pearl, honey, you got just as much right to live as anybody else. You ain't dead even though you've been acting like you are. Them words hit Pearl like a slap across the face, but maybe that's what she needed. After an hour of going back and forth, with herself she finally put on her least faded Sunday dress and climbed into Earl's old pickup truck, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The drive to Peachtree Grove was awkward, as a 3-legged dog at first, but slowly Pearl started to remember what it felt like to be outside them 4 walls that had become her prison. The Georgia countryside rolled by like a green carpet, and, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to notice how beautiful the world could be. At the farmer's market, Earl was gentle as could be, carrying Pearl's basket and helping her pick out the ripest tomatoes and sweetest peaches. When she laughed at something he said about a stubborn rooster, the sound surprised them both. It had been so long since Pearl had made any sound besides crying. Your laugh is beautiful, Earl said, and Pearl blushed like a schoolgirl, feeling guilty for enjoying herself when Billy Ray was cold in the ground. But their peaceful morning was shattered when Pearl spotted a familiar face across the market square. Mrs. Rachel Davis from Magnolia Creek was standing by the honey stand, her eyes wide as saucers as she took in the sight of Pearl and Earl together. Oh no, Pearl whispered, dropping the peach she'd been holding. Oh Lord, no. Pearl followed her gaze and saw Rachel Davis whispering furiously to 2 other women, all of them pointing and shaking their heads, like Pearl had committed some unforgivable sin. Pearl, look at me, Earl said, taking her trembling hands in his. "You ain't done nothing wrong. We're two adults enjoying a day at the market, that's all." But Pearl was already retreating into herself, that familiar shame washing over her like a flood. The ride home was silent as a tomb, and when Earl walked her to her door, she couldn't even look him in the eye. "Thank you for today," she whispered. "But I think it's best if we don't see each other anymore." That night, Pearl sat on her porch swing, rocking back and forth like a woman on the edge of madness. She could hear her phone ringing inside the house, probably folks calling to spread the news about her shameful behavior at the market. Round midnight, she saw headlights coming down Riverside Road, and her blood turned to ice when she recognized the car. It was Beulah May Henderson, Billy Ray's sister, driving down from Alabama with fire in her eyes and venom on her tongue. Pearl knew that whatever storm she'd weathered so far was nothing compared to what was coming. Beulah May had never liked her, always thought she wasn't good enough for her precious brother Billy Ray, and now she was here to make sure Pearl paid for her sins. As that car pulled into her driveway, Pearl May Johnson felt like she was about to face a firing squad. Her hands gripped the porch rail so tight her knuckles went white, and she started praying for strength she wasn't sure she had anymore. Little did Pearl know that Beulah May hadn't just come to shame her, she'd come to destroy her completely. And the weapon she carried was going to cut deeper than any knife ever could. Now y'all listen close, because what happened next was meaner than a copperhead in August heat. Beulah May Henderson stepped out of that car like the angel of death herself, her face twisted with righteous fury, and her mouth already running with poison before her feet even hit the ground. "Pearl May Johnson!" she hollered, stomping up them, porch steps in her Sunday shoes. "I drove 4 hours through Georgia heat to see if what I heard was true, and Lord have mercy, it's worse than I thought." Pearl's knees went weak as water, and she had to grip that porch rail to keep from collapsing. Beulah May had always been cruel as a barn cat, but the hatred burning in her eyes was something Pearl had never seen before. "Beulah May," Pearl whispered, her voice shaking like a leaf in a tornado. What brings you here?" "Don't you play innocent with me, you shameless woman," Beulah May spat, her finger pointing at Pearl like a loaded gun. "Rachel Davis called me personally to tell me about your disgraceful carrying on with some strange man at the farmer's market. My poor brother ain't even cold in his grave, and here you are gallivanting around like some Jezebel." Them words hit Pearl like physical blows, and she doubled over like she'd been punched in the stomach. "You were just what?" Beulah May's voice got louder, crueler. "You're 60 years old, Pearl. 60! What kind of fool makes a spectacle of herself at that age? You think my brother would want his wife acting like a loose woman, embarrassing his memory?" Pearl's tears started falling then, hot and shameful down her cheeks. Billy Ray told me before he passed that I should try to—" "Don't you dare put words in my dead brother's mouth!" Beulah May screamed, and Pearl flinched like she'd been slapped. "Billy Ray loved you more than you deserved, and this is how you honor his memory. By chasing after the first man who shows you attention." Every word was a knife twisting in Pearl's heart. She sank down, into that porch swing, her whole body shaking with sobs. "I wasn't chasing anybody. Earl he was being kind, and I'd been so lonely." "Lonely," Beulah May laughed, but it was a sound colder than January wind. "You got a roof over your head, food on your table, and the blessed memory of a good man who loved you. What more could a woman your age want?" I just wanted to feel alive again," Pearl whispered through her tears. "Alive?" Beulah May's voice turned deadly quiet. "You want to know what's alive, Pearl? My brother's memory, that's what. And you're spitting on it with every breath you take. The whole family back in Alabama is talking about this scandal. Cousin Martha's grandchildren are asking questions about Uncle Billy Ray's widow and her shameful behavior." Pearl looked up with horror. "The children know? Of course they know. Gossip travels faster than wildfire, and you done started a blaze that's burning down everything Billy Ray built. His good name, his reputation, all of it ruined because you can't act your age." The guilt crashed over Pearl like a tidal wave. She thought about Billy Ray's sweet nieces and nephews, imagined them whispering about their disgraced aunt, and the shame burned through her veins like acid. What do you want me to do?" Pearl asked, her voice broken and defeated. Beulah May's eyes glittered with cruel satisfaction. "I want you to end this nonsense right now. Cut all ties with this man, stop embarrassing the family, and start acting like the grieving widow you're supposed to be. And another thing," she paused, letting her next words sink in like poison. "This house belonged to my brother. His family's got more right to it than you do, especially if you're gonna use it for improper purposes. Pearl's blood went cold. You can't take the house. Billy Ray left it to me. Billy Ray left it to his wife, Beulah May said with a smile mean as a snake. A respectful, honorable wife, not some old fool chasing after men like a desperate spinster. You keep carrying on like this and the family might have to take legal action to protect Billy Ray's legacy. After Beulah May left, Pearl crawled into her house like a wounded animal seeking shelter. She pulled all the curtains closed, unplugged the phone and collapsed on Billy Ray's old chair, sobbing till she couldn't breathe. For 3 days, she didn't eat, didn't sleep, just sat there rocking back and forth, Beulah May's cruel words echoing in her head like a curse. When Earl came knocking, she hid in the bedroom, pressing her hands over her ears to block out his gentle voice calling her name. Pearl, honey, I know you're in there. Earl's voice carried through the walls. Whatever happened, whatever somebody said to you, we can work through it together. But Pearl couldn't face him. She couldn't face anybody. The shame was eating her alive from the inside out, and she felt like she was drowning in a sea of guilt and self-hatred. What Pearl didn't know was that Earl wasn't going to give up that easy, and sometimes it takes a broken man to understand exactly how to heal a broken woman's heart. Now listen here, sugar. While Pearl was hiding in that house like a wounded animal, Earl Thompson was pacing his broken-down porch like a man possessed. For 3 days straight, he'd knocked on Pearl's door, called her name till his voice went hoarse and got nothing back, but silence thick as cemetery dirt. Earl knew something terrible had happened. That scared, broken look in Pearl's eyes before. She disappeared, told him everything he needed to know. Somebody had hurt her deep, deeper than she could bear, and now she was drowning in shame that wasn't even hers to carry. On the 4th day, Earl's desperation drove him to Murphy's general store, where old man Murphy was stacking cans of beans like he'd been doing for 40 years. Murphy looked up when Earl walked in, and his weathered face creased with concern. Earl Thompson, Murphy said, setting down his boxes. You look like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. What's eating at you, son? Earl leaned against the counter, his hands shaking with frustration and heartbreak. It's Miss Pearl, Murphy. Something's happened to her, something. Bad, and she won't talk to nobody. She's locked herself in that house like she's waiting to die. Murphy's eyes softened with understanding. Ah, I see. Somebody's been filling her head with poison, have they? Let me guess. That viper Beulah May came slithering down from Alabama to spread her hate. You know about her sister-in-law? Son, I know everybody's story in 3 counties, and that woman's been carrying a grudge against Pearl since the day Billy Ray married her. Murphy pulled out 2 chairs and motioned for Earl to sit. You want to understand what you're up against? Let me tell you about Pearl May's life. For the next hour, Murphy unfolded Pearl's story like a map of pain, how she'd nursed Billy Ray through 2 years of lung sickness, watching him waste away while she sacrificed everything, her health, her dreams, her very soul, to keep him comfortable. How Billy Ray, God rest his soul, had been jealous as a bulldog, never letting Pearl have friends or go anywhere alone, keeping her isolated like a bird in a cage. That woman gave up 30 years of her life for Billy Ray, Murphy said, his voice heavy with sorrow. Never had children 'cause Billy Ray said they couldn't afford them. Never had friends 'cause Billy Ray said other people were trouble. Never had nothing but him, and when he died she was left with less than nothing. Earl's heart broke clean in 2 hearing it. Why didn't she ever fight back? Why didn't she live her own life? 'Cause she loved him, Murphy said simply. And love makes fools of us all, son, but here's what's eating at my conscience. Billy Ray came to see me 3 days before he passed. Sat right where you're sitting now, crying like a baby. Earl leaned forward. What did he say? He said he knew he'd been selfish, knew he'd kept Pearl from living her life, said he was scared she was gonna die with him, and he couldn't bear that burden. Made me promise that if anything ever happened to bring her some happiness, I'd encourage it. Murphy's voice cracked with emotion. That man begged me to make sure Pearl found a reason to keep breathing after he was gone. The revelation hit. Earl like lightning. She don't know about this conversation, does she? Never told her. Maybe I should have, but grief makes people do strange things. Now that Beulah May's filled her head with guilt and shame, Pearl thinks loving again would be betraying Billy Ray's memory. Meanwhile, across town, another conversation was happening that would change everything. Miss Dovie May Patterson, the wisest woman in Magnolia Creek and older than dirt itself, was sitting on her front porch when she saw Pearl's house dark as a tomb for the 4th day running. Dovie May had lived 87 years, buried 2 husbands, and learned more about love and loss than most people could handle. She'd watched Pearl waste away these past 5 years, and she'd had enough of everybody's foolishness. That afternoon, Dovey May marched herself over to Pearl's house, her walker banging against every step like a drum beat of determination. She didn't knock. She just opened that screen door and walked right in like she owned the place. "Pearl May Johnson," she hollered into the darkness. "You get yourself out here right now. I'm too old to be chasing you through this house like a scared rabbit." Pearl appeared from the bedroom looking like death warmed over. Her hair was tangled, her dress wrinkled, and her eyes were so swollen from crying she could barely see. "Miss Dovey, I can't. Please just leave me alone," Pearl whispered. "Leave you alone?" Dovey May's voice was sharp as a whip. "Child, I've been alone. I've been widowed at 50 and again at 65. I know what alone looks like, and this ain't it. This is self-pity wrapped up in false guilt, and I ain't having—" Pearl collapsed into Billy Ray's chair, sobbing fresh tears. "You don't understand. Beulah May was right. I'm too old. I'm embarrassing his memory. You're alive." Dovey May's voice thundered through that house. "You're alive, and that's more than Billy Ray can say. You think he's watching you from glory, wanting you to waste away to nothing? You think the good Lord gave you breath just so you could hold it till you die? But I'm 60 years old," Pearl cried. "What kind of woman my age—" "What kind?" Dovey May laughed, but it was a sound full of wisdom and pain. "The kind who deserves happiness, that's what kind. I remarried at 65 to a man who made my heart sing for 20 years. Best 20 years of my life. And anybody who said different could kiss my—" Dovey May caught herself and grinned. "Well, they could mind their own business. Point is, love don't have no expiration date, child. The heart don't come with a timer that says, sorry, you're too old now." But just as hope was beginning to flicker in Pearl's wounded heart, neither woman knew that Beulah May was already putting her next cruel plan into motion, and this time she was going to hit Pearl where it hurt most. Y'all, what happened next was going to test every ounce of courage Pearl May Johnson had left in her broken heart. After Miss Dovey May's visit, Pearl spent the whole night staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning like a tornado between hope and despair. Come morning, she was sitting on her porch swing when Earl's pickup truck came rumbling down that dirt. Rode like a man on a mission, Earl stepped out of that truck looking like he hadn't slept in a week, his clothes wrinkled and his eyes red with worry and determination. He walked up them porch steps slow but steady, like a man facing down his worst fear and deciding to do it anyway. "Pearl," he said, his voice gentle but firm as iron, "I ain't leaving this porch till you tell me what's eating at you. I can't stand seeing you suffer like this, and I sure ain't gonna let you disappear without a fight." Pearl looked up at him with eyes so full of pain it nearly brought Earl to his knees. "Earl, you don't understand. Beulah May, the things she said, I just can't do this anymore." "Then tell me," Earl said, settling down beside her. "On that swing. Tell me everything, Pearl. Let me carry some of this weight with you." And Lord have mercy, the floodgates opened, through tears that seemed like they'd never stop. Pearl told Earl about Beulah May's cruel visit, about the threats to take away the house, about the shame burning through her veins like poison. She told him about the whispers all over town, about how she was embarrassing Billy Ray's memory just by breathing. "I'm 60 years old, Earl," she sobbed, her voice breaking on every word. "What kind of fool woman my age thinks she deserves happiness? What kind of selfish person am I to want something for myself when my husband ain't even been gone 5 years?" Earl listened to every word, his heart breaking piece by piece as he watched this beautiful woman tear herself apart with guilt that wasn't hers to carry. When she finally finished, he took her trembling hands in his and looked straight into her wounded eyes. "Pearl, honey," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "let me tell you something about love. I loved my Martha with everything I had for 42 years. Watched her waste away for 2 years while that cancer ate her alive, and I would have traded places with her in a heartbeat." Pearl's tears kept falling, but she was listening. "When Martha died, I thought my life was over, thought love was something that only happened once and I'd used up my portion. But you know what Martha told me 3 days before she passed?" Earl's voice cracked, and tears started spilling down his weathered cheeks. "She said, 'Earl, honey, when I'm gone, don't you dare waste the life the good Lord gave you. Find somebody who makes you smile again, 'cause love don't subtract from love and it multiplies.'" Pearl's breath caught in her throat. She really said that?" "Cross my heart and hope to die," Earl said, smiling through his tears. "And you know what else? Old Murphy told me something yesterday that's gonna shock you. Billy Ray came to see him 3 days before he passed, crying like a baby." Pearl's hands went still. "Billy Ray crying? What did he say?" Earl's voice was gentle as morning dew. "He told Murphy he was scared you were gonna die with him, said he knew he'd been selfish, keeping you from living your own life, and he couldn't bear the thought of you wasting away after he was gone. Made Murphy promise to encourage you if happiness ever came knocking at your door. The words hit Pearl like a lightning bolt. All this time, she'd been carrying guilt for something Billy Ray himself had wanted for her. The relief and anguish crashed over her in waves, and she doubled over with sobs that came from the very depths of her soul. He really said that, she whispered through her tears. He did, honey. He loved you enough to want you to keep living after he couldn't. But even as hope flickered in Pearl's heart, the fear was still there, cold and choking. But Earl, what about Beulah May? What about the whole town talking? What about us? Earl interrupted, taking her face gently in his calloused hands. Pearl, I'm 65 years old, and I thought I was going to spend the rest of my days alone, just waiting to die. Then you walked into Murphy's store, looking like a lost angel, and something in my heart woke up that I thought was dead forever. Pearl's eyes went wide. Earl, you can't mean... I'm falling in love with you, Pearl May Johnson, Earl said, his voice strong and sure. I'm falling in love with your gentle heart, your wounded soul, and the way you make me want to be a better man. And if that scares folks, if that makes them talk, then let them talk till their tongues fall out. Pearl stared at him like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. But I'm a mess, Earl. I'm broken and scared and perfect, Earl finished. You're perfectly imperfect, just like me, just like everybody else on this earth. We're two broken people who might just be able to help each other heal. Pearl looked into Earl's eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in years. Genuine love, patient and kind and real. For the first time since Beulah May's visit, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she had a right to happiness. I'm scared, Earl, she whispered. Me too, honey, he said, pulling her close. But maybe we can be scared together. Just then a car came tearing down Riverside Road, kicking up dust like the devil himself was driving. Pearl's blood went cold when she saw who it was. Beulah May Henderson was back, and this time she had the whole Henderson family with her, ready to deliver a blow that would test whether love really could conquer the cruelest kind of hate. Y'all, hold on to your hats, because what happened next was going to shake Magnolia Creek to its very foundation. That 4th of July morning dawned hotter than a furnace, and the whole town was buzzing with excitement about the annual celebration in the town square. Pearl May had been hiding in her house for 2 weeks since Beulah May's last visit, but Earl's words of love had planted a seed of courage in her wounded heart. Beulah May Henderson had spent them 2 weeks like a spider spinning her web, whispering poison into every ear that would listen. She'd gathered up 3 more Henderson family members from Alabama, Billy Ray's cousins who barely knew Pearl, but were ready to judge her just the same. They'd set up camp at the Magnolia Creek Motel, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy Pearl's reputation once and for all. Today's the day we put an end to this shameful nonsense, Beulah May told her reinforcements over breakfast. Whole town's gonna be there, including the preacher and the church board. We're gonna make sure everybody knows what kind of woman Pearl May really is. Meanwhile, Pearl was sitting on her porch swing, staring at the red, white and blue bunting, decorating Main Street in the distance. For the first time in weeks, she'd put on a clean dress and combed her hair, but her hands were shaking like leaves in a windstorm. Earl appeared on her porch like an answer to prayer, dressed in his cleanest shirt and carrying a mason jar full of wildflowers he'd picked from his garden. Pearl, honey, he said, his voice gentle but determined. I know you're scared, but I got something to ask you. Pearl looked up at him with eyes still red from crying. Earl, I don't know if I can... Will you come with me to the celebration? Today, Earl interrupted, his weathered hands holding out them wildflowers like they were precious jewels. Not as my secret shame, not hiding in the shadows, but as the woman I'm proud to care about. Let's show this town that love don't have no age limit. Pearl's breath caught in her throat. The thought of facing all them judgmental eyes, all them wagging tongues made her stomach twist in knots. Earl, what if Beulah May makes a scene? What if everybody stares? What if they laugh at 2 old fools thinking they got a right to happiness? Earl sat down beside her on that swing and took her trembling hands in his. Then let 'em laugh, Pearl, let 'em stare. We've been hiding long enough, and I'm tired of letting other people's poisons steal our joy. An hour later, Pearl found herself walking hand in hand with Earl toward the town square, her heart hammering like a woodpecker against her ribs. The closer they got to the celebration, the more folks turned to stare. Some looked curious, some looked shocked, and some, like old. Murphy, who grinned and tipped his hat, looked downright pleased. The town square was packed tighter than sardines in a can. Red, white, and blue streamers hung from every tree, The smell of barbecue and funnel cakes filled the air, and the high school band was tuning up for their patriotic concert. Children ran between the booths, their laughter mixing with the chatter of neighbors catching up on gossip. That's when Beulah May struck like a copperhead in tall grass. Well, well, well. Her voice rang out sharp as a whip crack, causing conversations to die like flowers in a drought. Look what we got here, folks. Pearl May Johnson, parading around with her boyfriend like some teenage harlot. The crowd went silent as a graveyard. All eyes turned to Pearl and Pearl felt the shame wash over her like a flood. Her legs went weak, and she started to turn away, but Earl's grip on her hand tightened. "Don't you run, honey," he whispered fierce. She in her ear, "Don't you give that viper the satisfaction." Beulah May was just getting warmed up, her voice carrying across that square like a preacher delivering hellfire. "This woman, this 60-year-old woman, thinks she's got the right to dishonor my dead brother's memory by carrying on with Strange. Hamet, at her age, have y'all ever seen anything so disgraceful?" The crowd was murmuring now, some nodding along with Beulah May's poison, others looking uncomfortable but too scared to speak up. Pearl felt like she was drowning in a sea of judgment, but then something miraculous happened. Old Murphy stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face set with determination. "Beulah May Henderson," he said, his voice carrying clear as a church bell, "you need to stop this nonsense right now." "Stay out of this, Murphy," Beulah May snapped. "This ain't your business." "It is my business when you're spreading lies about good folks," Murphy shot back, "and I got something to tell this crowd that might change their tune about Pearl May Johnson." The square went quiet again, everybody leaning in to hear what Murphy had to say. Pearl looked at him with confusion and terror, not knowing what he was fixing to reveal. "Billy Ray Henderson came to my store 3 days before he passed," Murphy announced, his voice strong and clear. "Sat in my back room crying like a baby, confessing his regrets. You know what he told me? He said he'd been selfish, keeping Pearl from living her own life. Said he was scared she was going to die with him and he couldn't bear that burden." Gasps rippled through the crowd like stones thrown in still water. Beulah May's face went white as a sheet. "Billy Ray made me promise," Murphy continued, "that if happiness ever came knocking at Pearl's door, I'd encourage her to answer it. Said he wanted her to find a reason to keep breathing after he was gone." The revelation hit the crowd like lightning. Some folks started nodding, others wiped tears from their eyes, and Beulah May looked like she'd been slapped across the face. But the real shock came when Miss Dovie May Patterson stepped forward, her walker banging against the pavement with authority. "And I got something to add to Murphy's story," she declared, her voice crackling with righteous indignation. What happened next was going to turn this whole celebration upside down and prove once and for all that sometimes the truth has a way of shining brighter than the biggest lies. Y'all hold on to your hats because what happened next was going to shake Magnolia Creek to its very foundation. That 4th of July morning dawned hotter than a furnace, and the whole town was buzzing with excitement about the annual celebration in the town square. Pearl May had been hiding in her house for 2 weeks since Beulah May's last visit, but Earl's words of love had planted a seed of courage in her wounded heart. Beulah May Henderson had spent them 2 weeks like a spider spinning her web, whispering poison into every ear that would listen. She'd gathered up 3 more Henderson family members from Alabama, Billy Ray's cousins who barely knew Pearl, but were ready to judge her just the same. They'd set up camp at the Magnolia Creek Motel, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy Pearl's reputation once and for all. "Today's the day we put an end to this shameful nonsense," Beulah May told her reinforcements over breakfast. "A whole town's going to be there, including the preacher and the church board. We're going to make sure everybody knows what kind of woman Pearl May really is." Meanwhile, Pearl was sitting on her porch swing, staring at the red, white, and blue bunting decorating Main Street in the distance. For the first time in weeks, she'd put on a clean dress and combed her hair, but her hands were shaking like leaves in a windstorm. Earl appeared on her porch like an answer to prayer, dressed in his cleanest shirt and carrying a mason jar full of wildflowers he'd picked from his garden. "Pearl, honey," he said, his voice gentle but determined, "I know you're scared, but I got something to ask you." Pearl looked up at him with eyes still red from crying. "Earl, I don't know if I can—" "Will you come with me to the celebration today?" Earl interrupted, dropping to one knee right there on her porch. "Not as my secret shame, not hiding in the shadows, but as the woman I'm proud. Y'all hold on to your hats, 'cause what happened next was gonna shake. Y'all ain't gonna believe what happened next, but sometimes the good Lord works through the most unexpected people to deliver his justice." Miss Dovie May Patterson stood there in that town square like Moses himself, her walker planted firm on the ground and her eyes blazing with righteous fire. "Beulah May Henderson," Dovie May's voice rang out clear as a church bell. "You've been spreading lies and hate like the devil himself, but I got news for you and everybody else standing here. Love don't have no expiration date, and the heart don't. Come with a timer that says, 'Sorry, you're too old now.'" The crowd was hanging on every word, and Beulah May's face was turning redder than a Georgia sunset. "This ain't your business, you old—" "It is my business when I see cruelty disguised as righteousness," Dovie May shot back, her voice strong enough to wake the dead. "I'm 87 years old, buried 2 husbands and lived through more heartbreak than you could imagine. And let me tell you all something. I remarried at 65 to the sweetest man the good Lord ever made. Had 20 beautiful years with him before he went home to glory." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd. Some folks had forgotten about Dovie May's second marriage, and others were hearing about it for the first time. "But here's what really gets my blood boiling," Dovie May continued, her eyes never leaving Beulah May's shocked face. "You come down here from Alabama spreading poison about Pearl May's character, when you don't know the first thing about sacrifice. This woman nursed your brother through 2 years of suffering, gave up everything for him, and now you want to deny her a chance at happiness?" Earl felt Pearl's hand trembling in his, and he squeezed it tight, giving her strength. The crowd was dividing. Some still looked uncertain, but others were starting to nod in agreement with Dovie May's words. Then, like a miracle from heaven itself, Preacher Williams stepped forward from the crowd. He was a young man, new to Magnolia Creek, but his voice carried the authority of someone who truly understood the Lord's love. "Folks," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I've been listening to this conversation, and I feel the Lord move in me. Inna speak. The good book says, 'Judge not lest ye be judged,' and it also says that love is patient, love is kind. I don't see nothing in Scripture that puts an age limit on the heart's capacity for love." Beulah May looked like she'd been struck by lightning. "Preacher, surely you can't be supporting this shameful behavior." "Ma'am," Preacher Williams replied, his eyes kind but unwavering, "what I see here is 2 people who've suffered great loss finding comfort in each other's company. If that's shameful, then I reckon the good Lord's got some explaining to do about his own commandment to love one another." The crowd was shifting now, and Pearl could feel the tide turning. But the real shock came when Earl suddenly stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination that surprised even Pearl. "Folks," Earl said, his voice carrying across that square like thunder, "I got something to say, and y'all gonna listen whether Beulah May likes it or not." Earl looked around at all them faces, some curious, some judgmental, some hopeful. "I'm 65 years old, and I thought my life was over when my Martha passed. Thought love was something that only happened once and I'd used up my share. But Pearl May Johnson," his voice cracked with emotion, "Pearl May taught me that the heart's got more room than we ever imagined." Pearl's tears were flowing freely now, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. "I'm asking this woman to marry me," Earl declared, his voice strong and proud. "Right here, right now, in front of God and everybody, 'cause life's too short to waste on worry about what other people think." The crowd gasped as Earl dropped to one knee right there in the town square, pulling out a simple gold ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "Pearl May Johnson, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Pearl stood there frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird finally seeing the door to its cage swing open. The whole town square was silent as death, waiting for her answer. Beulah May looked like she was about to faint, and the Henderson cousins were whispering frantically among themselves. Through her tears, Pearl looked down at Earl's hopeful face, then out at the crowd of neighbors who'd watched her waste away. For 5 long years, some looked judgmental, others looked hopeful, but most looked like they were finally seeing her as a human being instead of just Billy Ray's leftover widow. "Earl Thompson," Pearl said, her voice shaking but clear. "I been hiding from life for too long, letting fear and shame keep me locked away like I was already dead. But you made me remember what it feels like to be alive." She paused, taking a deep breath that felt like the first real breath she'd taken in years. "Yes, Earl. Yes, I'll marry you." The town square erupted. Some folks cheered, others clapped, and a few, led by Murphy and Dovie May, started crying tears of joy. Even some of the church ladies who'd been whispering about Pearl found themselves smiling, despite their better judgment. But Beulah May wasn't done fighting. "This is disgraceful," she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. "My brother's memory deserves better. That's when something beautiful happened. Young Tommy Henderson, Billy Ray's nephew, who'd driven down from Alabama with Beulah May, stepped away from his cousins and walked over to Pearl. "Aunt Pearl," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "Uncle Billy Ray talked about you all the time. When I was growing up, he always said you were the strongest woman he knew, and he'd want you to be happy. Don't let Mama's bitterness steal your joy." Beulah May's face went white as she watched her own son turn against her cruelty. Other family members started stepping forward too, confessing they'd been uncomfortable with Beulah May's vendetta, but hadn't known how to stop it. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, when the leaves were turning gold and red like God's own paintbrush had touched them, Pearl May Johnson became Pearl May Thompson in a simple ceremony at the Little White Church. She wore a pale blue dress she'd sewn herself, and Earl stood there nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm, but grinning like a fool. The church was packed with neighbors who'd come to celebrate love triumphant over prejudice. Murphy gave Pearl away. Dovie May sat in the front row crying happy tears, and even some of the folks who'd gossiped the worst showed up to witness this miracle of second chances. Beulah May didn't come, of course. She'd gone back to Alabama in defeat, taking her poison with her. But several Henderson family members stayed for the wedding, including young Tommy, who told Pearl he was proud to have her as family. As Pearl and Earl stood in Earl's herb garden, after the ceremony, surrounded by the sweet smell of lavender and the gentle buzz of honeybees, Pearl learned to tend the healing plants, while Earl learned to mend buttons on her old Singer machine. "Never too late to learn new things," Pearl said, her voice filled with wonder at how much her world had changed. "Never too late to love," Earl replied, pulling his new wife close as the Georgia sun set behind the pine trees, painting the sky in shades of hope and new beginnings. And so Pearl May learned that our hearts don't come with expiration dates, y'all. Sometimes the good Lord saves the sweetest chapters for last, when we finally find the courage to turn the page. This here story proves that our hearts don't come with no expiration dates, y'all. Pearl and Earl found something beautiful when they stopped letting fear make their decisions. But here's what I want to ask you. What dreams have you put on hold because you worried about what others might think? What chances for happiness are you letting slip by because society tells you it's too late? Listen, sugar, if you're watching this and thinking I'm too old for love, or I'm too old to chase that dream, Pearl's story is shouting at you, that's a lie. At 60, Pearl discovered that love doesn't have an age limit. Your golden years can truly be golden, filled with new adventures, deep connections, and yes, even romance. Life doesn't stop at 50, 60, or 70. It keeps being yours to live fully, to love completely, and to dream courageously. If this story touched your heart, I need you to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. These stories of courage and second chances need to be heard. And don't you dare stop here. Click on that next video appearing on your screen titled Daughter of Millionaire Planter Who Discovered Crimes of Husband and Was Locked as Crazy in Cotton, because these tales of triumph will keep your spirit lifted and your hope alive. Remember, it's never too late to live the life you were meant to live.